Hey everyone, here we are with another topic, and we're going to start talking about the immune system a little bit. So we're going to kind of take the 10,000 foot view, get into a few details, but hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the vertebrate immune system when we get done. We're going to start with what's known as the innate immune system in this first talk. So before we get into the details, think about all the groups we've talked about in zoology that are parasites of humans and other vertebrates, right? Flatworms, nematodes, arthropods, protozoans, all those animal groups that can cause disease in us when they try to parasitize us. Or, those groups that use us as part of their life cycle. And then there are also lots of other non-animals organisms, like bacteria and fungi, that obviously cause a lot of disease. And viruses, which are, not really living things, but also cause terrible diseases. There's lots of these things that are constantly trying to parasitize and attack us. And one of the amazing things about humans is we have this great immune system to try to combat all these organisms. And so we're going to talk about the immune system, and like I said, we're going to start with the innate defense, and then later on we'll talk about the acquired defense. So one caveat before we get started here, we're mostly following the book, which is a good thing. There are many constituents to the immune system. Very complicated. You can do a whole semester on immunology. Those of you who are going to vet school, med school, you're going to do multiple semesters on this. So there's lots of things. There's many ways to organize the information. There's lots of overlap of different systems. There's lots of moving parts. It's very complicated. We're going to try to keep it simple, just give you a basic idea. Again, kind of the 10,000 foot view here, all right? But hopefully we'll learn enough, to pique your interest and to help you understand some of the basics of the immune system in, and specifically we're going to be talking about humans here. Other vertebrates, other organisms have immune systems, but we're going to talk about the human immune system. So like I said, we got two main things we're going to talk about: innate defense and acquired defense. And so the innate defense is your first line of defense. And it's very rapid, quick response to a pathogen. So a pathogen is anything that's invaded your body that you need to get rid of. The acquired defense is more delayed. It's not as quick, and it's very specific. The innate defense is very general. Just anything that gets into your body, your innate defense is going to attack. The acquired defense is designed for specific invaders. And it's sort of your second line of defense. And then the acquired defense can be broken down into the humoral response and the cell-mediated response. And so we'll get into those in more detail in a little bit. So as we said, the innate defense is a general defense against pathogens. It's non-specific. But it does set up the acquired defense. So you'll notice there's going to be a lot of signaling between these two groups. There's not a hard line between them. There's lots of cells that are involved in both, signaling between both. The innate sets up the acquired, so they definitely work together. And so what do we mean when we talk about the innate defense, the general defense, or the first line of defense? Very simply, the first line of defense are barriers, right? Your skin keeps a lot of things out. Your mucous membranes are designed to trap things before they can get into your body. And so then the mucus just is a sticky substance that grabs them, and then you can, blow your nose or cough and get rid of them. Stomach acid. Stomach acid is important for digestion of food, but it also is a first line of defense, because think about it, your stomach is where you're constantly putting foreign things into your body. And so it's the one part of your body where you're supposed to be putting stuff in all the time. And so it'd be a very easy mode of infection, a very easy way for pathogens to get into your body. And so that's another reason why you have such strong stomach acid, is to kill those things that are trying to invade that way. Then another part of the innate defense are what are known as the internal defenses. So these are cells and proteins that are specifically designed to attack pathogens. And finally, inflammation is another part of the innate defense. Okay, so one of the things we need to talk about when we talk about innate defense is phagocytosis. And we've talked about this before. That's one cell engulfing another and then digesting it. And so it's either a cell that's engulfing another cell, or maybe it's some debris, maybe it's part of a cell that's died, or maybe it's, in this example, the other cell is a bacterium or a foreign invader. It's something that gets engulfed, surrounded by a cell, and the substance that's engulfed is now in a vacuole, right? You build a membrane around it, and now you've got it in a vacuole, and then another vacuole that has lysosomes or other molecules can fuse with that vacuole and then digest it. And so we talked about this way back when we talked about cells. And that's what they're showing you here, is just a cell engulfing another cell. Then a lysosome fuses with it and it destroys it. Now this is how single-celled organisms feed, right? So they just engulf other things and then use lysosomes. And so then when multicellularity evolved from single-celled organisms, this trait was retained, and then it became part of the immune system. And so in the immune system, in humans, phagocytes are cells that do phagocytosis, that use phagocytosis on pathogens. And there are a few of these different kind of cells whose job it is to go and surround the pathogen and then digest it. And so neutrophils are a type of white blood cell. They're the most common type of white blood cell. That's one of their jobs. Eosinophils, they also are phagocytes. And then there's a different kind of white blood cell called a macrophage. So these are all types of white blood cells that do phagocytosis. And so let's talk about white blood cells for a second, because they are, the functional unit of your immune system. They're also called leukocytes. Red blood cells can also be called erythrocytes. And so they're blood cells, so they're found in blood, but they're also found in lymph. And so the lymphatic system is an important location for these white blood cells. And like I said, they're central to the immune defense. And there's a lot of names here. So I've worked really hard to try to organize these in a way to kind of help you keep them straight in your brain. The first way we can divide them is granulocytes and agranulocytes. And that just has to do with how they stain and how they look under a microscope. And so the granulocytes, you've got those neutrophils we talked about, the eosinophils we talked about, and also basophils. Those are granulocytes. And then agranulocyte cells are lymphocytes and monocytes. And so here's a figure from your book, kind of just showing you again these 5 different types. Some of these white blood cells are important to the innate defense. Some of these are important to the acquired defense. But there's a lot of crossover between. So there's a lot of these that have a job in both the innate and acquired. Just like I said, you can't really draw a hard line between innate and acquired. They complement each other and blend into one another. So here's a figure from your book kind of showing you different types of white blood cells. And so these white blood cells are formed in the bone marrow. And you start with this stem cell. And so a stem cell is a cell that has not yet diversified. And so it has the ability to become different cells depending upon which genes get turned on. And so what they're showing you here is from the stem cells in the bone marrow, you can have different types of white blood cells that all can be formed. And we'll kind of talk about each of these cells. So you've got the intermediate cells, but all the way at the very bottom, toward the bottom, at the very bottom is where you've got the active cells that are going to take place in the, they're going to work in the immune system. And so these are all the agranulocytes, okay? And so they form in the bone marrow. And so again, this chart does not show every type of leukocyte. For example, it doesn't show those granulocytes. They form somewhere else in the body and they have different properties. And so you can see one of the white blood cells that we talked about. We talked about macrophages, and those form from monocytes. And so that's one type of white blood cell that can form from these stem cells. And then the rest of these cells are the lymphocytes. So you remember we said there's monocytes, or there's macrophages, monocytes, and lymphocytes. And this is what we're talking about, all right? And so within each of those divisions, then you have other types of divisions. Like I said, we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail as we go along. And so again, the phagocytes are have a pretty straightforward job. They recognize a pathogen and they eat it, right? So they recognize non-self cells. They recognize cells that don't belong in your body, and they just engulf them and digest them. It's not very sophisticated, but it works very well. And so this is one of your first lines of defense. If your body detects a foreign cell, these macrophages just come along, these other phagocytes come along and just chew it up before it can cause too much damage. Okay, so all that phagocytosis takes place when the pathogen is outside your cells. It's in the interstitial space, right? It's invaded your body, but it has not yet got into the cells. Once the pathogen gets into the cell, well, then you need a different strategy. Sometimes that the macrophage can eat your own cell, but they're supposed to recognize your cells and not eat your cells. So if the pathogen is in your cell, there are other strategies. And one of those strategies is to use a natural killer cell, which is, like the best cell name ever, right? And so once the pathogen gets in the cell, then these natural killer cells can detect that, and they go and they kill your cell because it's got a pathogen in it. They don't eat it, they don't phagocytosis. What they do is called apoptosis, cell death. So they just go and poke holes in it. And so that can also be an effective way to kill a cell, is you just poke enough holes that the membrane is so leaky that the cell can't function. Think about all the things we've talked about which involve, creating a difference of potential across cell membranes. Think about the cell membrane itself. It's designed to keep things out and only let certain things in. And so if you just go poking holes in it, then the cell membrane doesn't function like it's supposed to, and the cell can't function like it's supposed to. And so that's how the natural killer cells kill these infected cells. So they kill your own cells which have been infected. Yeah. Okay. And so then again, if you look at this chart, you can see that that's a different line of cells, a different fate of these stem cells. They can make some of these natural killer cells, and they're again part of the innate defense. They can just attack, they're kind of a general attack. And so then the last portion of the innate defense that we mentioned is inflammation. And so typically when cells in your body get damaged by something, you have an inflammatory response. And so you've observed this. You get a cut or a scratch, or you get, hit by a ball, you get a bruise or something, and it swells up. So part of the reason it swells up is this innate defense. It's a rapid initial response to tissue damage, and it's designed to sort of jumpstart the innate defense. It's what you could call the fire alarm. It's going to start releasing lots of chemicals and start producing lots of things in a damaged area that's going to activate the innate defense in that area and start firing up that innate defense to start, because cell damage means that there's probably pathogens that got in. And so it's going to, one of the things that this inflammation response does is it calls these phagocytes to the damaged area. So you've got these phagocytes that are designed to engulf pathogens, and if you've got a cut or some place where you probably have those pathogens, well, you need to call those signal those macrophytes to come and start doing their job. One part of this inflammatory response is the release of histamine. And so those basophils we mentioned, they release histamine. There's also cells called mast cells. These aren't white blood cells, these are a different kind of cell, but they also release histamine. And so the histamine is kind of one of the starting molecules that starts this cascade of other signals that starts calling in the innate defense. And so you'll see as we talk about the immune system, it's a lot of chemical signaling to, communicate among these cells to get them to do their job. Now, some of you have allergies. I have really bad allergies, seasonal allergies. And if you're having an allergic reaction, that's because your immune system is over-responding to a pathogen. And so, for example, tree pollen or something that causes like my allergies, that's not really a dangerous pathogen, but your body is reacting as if it's a dangerous pathogen and releasing that histamine to fire up this inflammatory response to start your innate defense, but you don't really need to. And so you get the the puffy eyes and the runny eyes and the itching and all the things that come with allergies. So that's one side effect of an overactive immune system. And so one way to compensate for that is to take antihistamines, right? And so you're probably familiar with that. Your Benadryls or your Claritins or whatever, they're antihistamines. And what they do is they bind to histamine receptors. So to start this inflammatory response, these cells release histamine, which go to receptors on other cells and trigger them to release other molecules and starts this whole response. But the antihistamine binds to the histamine receptor. So when histamine comes along, it's got nothing to bind to, and so it doesn't have an effect. And so that's kind of what your antihistamines do to help you with your allergies. Now there's other molecules that get released, and some of these get released because the histamine signals them to release, and some of these get released, again, this is part of that. There's a complex series of chemicals that gets released, and if you study immunology, you'll learn about these in much more detail. And so there's things like prostaglandins, and you remember prostaglandins, we talked about those before. That's a type of molecule that gets released when there's some kind of tissue damage or you need to start the inflammatory response. There's things called complement proteins. There's lots of stuff that also gets released as part of this inflammatory response. Excuse me. And so these chemicals then start signaling other cells and start causing a reaction in your body, right? It dilates blood vessels. And so dilate means to, relax, and the blood vessels relax and open up, which allows more blood cells, but there's more permeability, so more proteins leak out of the blood, and these proteins act as signals, and the extra blood causes the swelling, and extra fluid causes the swelling and the redness and the heat. And there's platelets that get released to help blood clot, because these are all things that are good, should happen if you have tissue damage. And then again, there's chemical signals that start attracting the neutrophils and the macrophages, start attracting those phagocytes to come, because there's a good chance there's pathogens that need to be attacked. So it's a very sophisticated, eating these other cells, that's not a very sophisticated thing, but all this signaling, that starts to get pretty sophisticated and complicated. Again, you can kind of link this back to things we talked about earlier. Remember, we talked about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. And we said that they work by blocking the enzymes that make prostaglandins, right? And these prostaglandins are part of the inflammatory response. So why do we call them non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs? Because they stop these prostaglandins, which are part of the inflammatory response, right? So, if you have swelling in that, these drugs will help that swelling go down for the same reason that they can also block pain. So it all comes together. So that was just kind of a brief intro into the innate immune defense. And these are the things that get fired up when you first have tissue damage or you first detect a pathogen. But then they are setting up your body for the acquired defense. And so in the future lectures, then we're going to go into details about the acquired defense. And so that's all I have on innate defense right now. So I guess I will see you in a second. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.